So I'll dive right into a story because I think origins tell you a lot about people and tell you a lot about their background. So I was 26 and I was working for Stephen P. Jobs. This was after he was kicked out of the beloved company that he founded, Apple Computer. And he had started appropriately his next adventure called NeXT. And it was a job I was completely unqualified for. I mean, I was Steve's purported writer. So my job was to supposedly extract the ideas that he had in his brain and get them down on paper. So much has been written about Steve. Some of it's false. A lot of it is true. He is incredibly masterful in how he thinks. So being the person who's supposed to write down what goes on in that brain is basically an impossible job. So this particular day, I accompanied Steve to a meeting in what they called Building 2. And Building 2 was this kind of creative nirvana. It was this place where the engineering team did all of its work, and normal mere mortals like me were not usually allowed to go in it. But because my job was supposedly to write down for Steve what the machine was all going to be about, what the next machine was about, he allowed me to accompany him to this meeting of engineers. So we walk into Building 2, and Steve's in his classic turtleneck. He really does wear turtlenecks all the time. Turtleneck, New Balance shoes, leans into the room. He has kind of a weird way he enters a room, which he kind of falls into the room. And he sits down at this table, and we're looking at the motherboard of the next machine. And this was an interesting thing because we had just gotten new chips in from Motorola. And the big debate at the time was, were the chips going to be powerful enough to power the operating system? Also a work in progress. So we had this kind of double philosophical debate. Are the chips fast enough? And is it going to be able to support the software? And the software itself was not done. So I'm sitting there with my little steno pad thingy with, trying to handwrite things as it fell out of his head. And he sits and he looks at the board. And he says, guys, why is this board so asymmetrical? It's just sloppy. Like, we can do better than this. And then he gets up. And actually, not in a fuss, not in a crazy thing, he walks out of the room. Okay, so now I'm in a building I'm not supposed to be in, supposedly writing down thoughts from the CEO who's left the room, working with all these engineers who I don't understand, looking at what seemed to me a completely symmetrical board, although Steve said it wasn't. Okay. What's interesting is what happened next. The hardware engineers in the room and the software engineers in the room started talking, actually not about the board. They started talking about what the users of these next machines would do. And they started to kind of play out, almost fantasize what the software would be capable of doing. Steve rejoined the room after they had had their 15 minutes of back and forth debate, and he said in very calm terms, guys, we can't have imperfection in the way we think. We can't have imperfection in the way this board is designed. My comment is not about the electrical engineering. My comment is about whether we will permit ourselves to have defects in our work. Most of you know NeXT's story, which is actually, it was never a commercial success, even though it had incredible financial backing and it had, in my opinion, some of the most brilliant engineers in the world. What's interesting about the story, though, is that when you re-intersect Steve Jobs and his company that threw him out, when he came back to Apple, he brought with him NeXT, the operating system, NeXT, the hardware platform, and most importantly, NeXT as a culture of excellence and perfection. And the rest has been much written about, but it's an amazing story of what a CEO does based on what he sees. Steve had this extraordinary ability to see defects. There was an IMPay designed staircase in Building 1 that he had redone twice. So imagine calling IMPay and saying, I don't find your work satisfactory for the next computer company. He had the tiles laid in the men's bathroom 3 times because of 2 tiles that were askew. Steve's point was not, as has been written about, an obsession about detail, although he certainly had that. It was about building a culture that doesn't tolerate defect as its starting point of design. So that was me at 26 in a job that I was completely unqualified for. It was an amazing learning lesson about what's required to be a CEO, and what is an amazing learning lesson of what it means to be a designer. So fast forward, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years, and go around the sun lots of times, and things that you really suck at when you're beginning, you get better at because you learn how to experiment your way into them. And I encountered this CEO. So Aaron Sorkin would have you believe that Mark Zuckerberg is kind of crazy and kind of self-absorbed. And I actually didn't experience Mark that way at all, although he is an extraordinary contrarian. So my job, I work with CEOs all the time to help them imagine the future of their companies. And sitting across the table, our team sitting across the table with Mark, we had all these suggestions. Well, Mark, this is when they had about 50 million users on Facebook. Well, if you want to grow your company at scale, don't you have to change the way you recruit? Why don't you recruit more the way, say, eBay did and what Meg Whitman did in her early days at eBay? And he's like, very calmly, well, why would I want to use someone else's best practice to build my company? Well, it would be better for product marketing and product management if you had a more linear development cycle, a little bit more the way Apple does it, where you get Facebook on a regular cycle of releasing products. Well, why would I want to emulate Steve when I'm not in the same business Steve's in? Okay, so when you're a consultant, this is a very sucky situation. Because you sit there and you're like, okay, all the ideas, all the thoughts that were supposedly my knowledge I'm bringing to the table are rendered completely blanco, null and void. So what's interesting about Mark, and I think it was the learning lesson, I will absolutely tell you, I'm not sure that our company had anything to do with Facebook's success. Actually, every piece of advice I think was summarily rejected. Everything we co-created together, I think, was also rejected. But what was the great learning lesson about Mark is what he saw in the world. So CEOs, so the eyes that they look through the world, they see certain things, right? And so most people, when they look at a picture in the museum or this tangled web of rope, will see the rope. It's how we're trained. It's almost all of us who have rational backgrounds from good schools and great degrees will see the rope. And what's interesting about Mark is, yeah, he acknowledges the rope, but actually it's the space in between that Mark looks at all the time. He can look into any crowd of people, and yes, he sees individuals as individuals, but more importantly, he sees the things that connect those individuals. Maybe the one small contribution we made during that period of time was watch Mark find his own words to describe this phenomenon, this thing that he calls the social graph. It's something that's out there that connects us all, and it's basically invisible to us until you make it visible through these connections on Facebook. Mark has this gift for seeing that human experience. He sees not just the nodes on the network, not just the places where the rope intersects. He sees the interstitials, the part that's invisible, the connection of this social graph that connects all of us. And in the process of being a CEO, he's designing connection between all of us as individuals. Obviously, some 820 million users later, Mark knew exactly what he was doing when he was designing his company.